I would say that quite often they are complementary in the approaches. Obviously, there are some arguments in different methods. But one thing that I would like to mention is, for instance, Paul Littlefair and the British Standard 8202 are not mandatory, as they were mentioned, and therefore they have been widely used in councils or not, as John Walker presented. I would like also to raise a question that was mentioned, or a point that was mentioned by Andrew, about the accuracy of new methods, and especially in regards to models that we are using for base our assumptions in our calculations, but also in terms of accrediting the professionals, and as well as John Walker mentioned, the lack of, or the professionals in this area, or schools that actually can prepare the new generations for these studies. I would also like to emphasize the new approaches as looking not exclusively, obviously, on daylighting and sunlighting approaches for approval of planning applications, and looking at different amenity index as proposed by Simone. But I would also like to, if possible, raise the situation that I was surprised that none of you mentioned, which is the association that can be seen in your planning guidelines, in the planning policy framework, for instance, for London, in a new publication that it's under debate about other environmental areas. For instance, the association with climate change, and by raising the density, what will be that impact? That's one of the issues. And lastly, I would like to highlight that there are new tools, there are methods, but also how easy are they easy to use by most of our designers, and also by the planning councils to actually validate and confirm those studies to approve for developing, obviously, a better city. In this case, examples were made for London, but we can expand, obviously, for other urban scenarios. So my idea is just to be strict, and you've seen the 5 presentations. I will open this debate to the audience, and I would like you to raise questions to our presenters, by specifically, if you want to address all of them or one in particular, to highlight that. But I will be strict not to overload one person in particular, so I will probably moderate that debate if one is being harassed with too many questions versus the others. Thank you. So please mention your name just for the purpose, and we only have microphones at key areas, so I would ask you to speak loud if possible, because we are recording this session. Thank you. Is there anyone that would like to raise?
So I'm Richard Howard, Watts Group. You've introduced different methods of looking at the assessments and the pros and cons of all of them. How do we get around the fact that they're only discretionary guidance to the local authorities? Like, whatever you want to bring in, if it's only guidance, how do we get around the fact that we're never going to be able to meet these without it being a hard and fast rule? To anyone, really? Probably John,
Well, I mean, I'll start that. I remember Paul's first edition, I'm afraid to say, and I've still got somewhere some of the early editions he did before it was published, and I think I recall the pepper pot method of calculating daylight. And I think there was a lot of people, Swiss around the 80s, said, don't do it this way, do it this other way. As far as I'm concerned as a planner, We need, any planning authority wants a consistent way these things are done. The developer wants a consistent way of doing it across one borough to another. So that the good thing about the document actually is, you use vertical sky component, that it's not a precise science, it helps you in your decision making, and it's easy to use. I think the guidance we had before was more difficult. I remember as a junior officer using wall-drum diagrams and all sorts and having to do it by hand, and it took an awful long time. Now with all the computer models we've got, it is a lot easier. I'm not saying that the tried and tested methodology that we've had since 1991, I think it was, there's not time for a rethink. And I rather like John's presentation. I'm rather attracted by what that's got to show, and I think there's room to have a debate about, do we replace what we've got now with a new way of looking at this, with new standards that are totally different. I think one of the problems that Paul's got, and he can answer this himself, is you need the government backing on this, and trying to get the government to agree to changes that give new national standards is something they're reluctant to do at the moment. Is that a fair reflection?
Yes.
He agrees. Yeah.
Alistair Redler. Bearing in mind the climate-based modelling illustration and the difficulty with trying to meet VSE standards in a city with a requirement for balconies and interesting building shapes and so on, is it time to incorporate a radiance type analysis or climate-based modelling analysis, which would then allow designers to use the reflectance effects of that modelling in their design? So, for example, in materials used for underside balconies, for recesses, and so on, to show that the actual light inside a room is actually better than the simple form from the VSC. VSC being, of course, very useful when we didn't have computers and there was a need to be able to calculate quickly and efficiently. We now don't need to do that, we've got computers. So is there grounds for planning authorities actually adopting a more real-world environment for the inner cities?
I think you've got to differentiate between somebody designing a new building, and architects take all sorts of things into account. And depending on what the user is, they want to get light into different spaces. So if it's a university building or something, they're designing the building in a way where they want to flood light into a central atria or something. And that's down to the individual architect. I don't think it's for the planning authority to say there's not enough light going into that space in that university. Where we get pulled into it is it's up to the user of a new building as in terms of what criteria they're going to set for what they want in their building. When somebody's putting up a building and it's affecting somebody else and they're worried about it, then that's a different conversation. We don't want it too complicated. We get some amazing buildings designed with fantastic space, with fantastic light at different times of the day and year. That's all been thought through. That's all great. But we're not going to refuse consent because when it's not amazing enough the amount of lighting levels you're getting inside that building, it's buyer and user aware. And what we're interested in is you're putting something up, the next door neighbour's worried about it, they're objecting about it. What's the criteria for assuring them it's not as bad as it is, or saying to them, we're going to shave a bit off and it is going to greatly improve your amenity. That's what we're mainly concerned about.
I would add to that, in terms of actually planning, I would favour the aperture-based approach, the climate-free, rather than a climate-based one. However, once you've done that, then you could use the climate-based approach to say, well, how can we make it better than the minimum through employing reflection? I mean, you see a lot of the deep re-entrant spaces around the back of Victorian buildings where they have been painted white, and these they can add quite a bit. But I think the danger of including it is that, as was mentioned before, it just lets standards slip. Then saying like always rely on that and so forth, and so people will stick 100% reflectance for an outside surface, which isn't going to stay like that.
And don't forget there's other considerations. So I had a meeting this morning where a developer came in for a pretty much glass building. I said, sorry, but this entire area is all stone and they're solids, and the windows, the apertures are quite small. It's totally out of character with the area. So as much as we appreciate it's going to give you a really dynamic lighting inside the building, you're not going to get it in this location. There's other factors that always come into account.
To deal with yours and the earlier question, if you departed from the norm at the moment, you would expose yourself to other criticisms, where both OICS and CIBSE have in their sort of gift the ability to resolve that, is to publish something that we can quote that allows some form of consensus that we as practitioners come up with to allow us to argue an alternative. We have consensus today that the BRE guide is non-mandatory guidance. Is it a case that we as practitioners have been too shy to show other calculations, particularly on the larger schemes? Should we be more confident in our skills and start to argue the wider debate? To do that, I think we need something formal, that when the complaint comes in, that we've got something to cross-reference it to and say, I am not a maverick loon. I am complying with, this is allowed in the custom and practice of my profession. And then that would facilitate, I think, particularly in the larger schemes that are the issue, some of the alternate that GIA has come up with, the alternate that you're thinking of. There are other ways we can argue and justify the schemes, but we need something to release us from our current custom and practice.
Can I just answer? I take the point about liability, certainly about institutional criticism, but if our clients know why we're arguing it and that it is not the standard and we're arguing it for a purpose, and the planning authority accept it and give planning consent, then I can't see how we have any criticism. Third parties have no real right to criticise us to our institutions, so I don't really see that we have a risk about that. I think it's for us to make the case and to make it honestly and accurately. Same as way that nobody checks actual computer modelling of daylight consultants when it goes into planning application. They just comment on the report. We don't know who's putting in inaccurate and inaccurate modelling, which would be completely at the other end of a fraudulent scale. I don't think anyone is, but it could be happening.
Well,
that'd be a different thing.
It does happen. I've been sent reports to look at and to check, but that never comes out because it never goes to court.
And in some ways, those who have been caught are not the people that are sat in here. As again, when I give my sort of public facing and I talk about what does it mean to be a chartered UK professional, believe it or not, we all take it very seriously. This self-regulating that we do to ourselves is actually working. But because there is no control over who can currently submit a daylight and sunlight report, you only have to go through some local authority applications and you will see things that will shock you. Who on earth has wrote this? And literally, models, they've bought a freebie bit of software, and what you've got is a block v something else, and this is what they're putting forward in credible terms, because an inexperienced planning officer doesn't know to be able to say this is worthless paper. And that's the problem. We are being at one level tarred by all the people, if you like, who would never come to this type meeting. So we do need to protect ourselves, because there are live issues that have been made against reputable practices by third parties who have challenged the accuracy of numbers, the accuracy of computer models, and once you start getting into the numbers, the reasonable opinions that we are making as practitioners against those numbers. And this is where numbers and targets matter. Because when you get accused, not of being negligent, but of being dishonest, it's a different level of accusation going against a practice. Your whole credibility is that our numbers that we generate are truthful. If your practice suddenly got a reputation for generating worthless numbers, what's going to happen the next time you put the planning application into Westminster and it's backed up by your report? Are they going to accept it? They're going to go, no. You have just been held as being a liar in terms of your report assessments. Throw it out. Get someone else in.
Can I just add to that? The Extel Corporation, the developers of what used to be called the Nordstrom Tower, one of the things they looked at was all the validation publications that I sent them about the core engine and its accuracy and reliability. And that was verified using a fantastic data set collected by Paul here in the 90s. Yeah. So yeah, those issues are important.
I'm Simone from the Institute of Sustainable Heritage at UCL. John is about the first planning person I've come across who really understands daylight, but frankly, I have worked with doing in the past. Firstly, I worked 10 years teaching architects and interior designers how to do daylight and sunlight studies. And secondly, I used to do planning application, the sunlight and daylight study for planning applications using the simple manual methods. Now, it's difficult, but actually it's actually reasonably easy to demonstrate to a planning officer using the manual methods what the methodology you've actually used. When you go from simple manual methods to computer methods, it's incredibly easy to pull the wool over planning officers because no one knows what you're doing, and this distinction between CIE sky and uniform sky, well, that completely goes over their head. So we really have a need to actually verify and justify computer methods which conform to the standards that were established in the British Standard and the BRE guide. The BRE vertical sky component is a very strong tool to use to look at the impact on adjacent buildings. Average daylight factor is as long as a piece of string, frankly, and you can mess it up in a number of ways and get the figure you want. So I think we need to start with simple standards, but also have established methods to demonstrate it by using new computer methods.
The climate-free approach, just the aperture indices, is purely geometrical, and so
And
anybody can check the geometry. You have the answer is as reliable as your geometry. And indeed, there's nothing going on under the hood in terms of simulation. There isn't really any simulation going on. It's just a line of sight calculation. So I say as long as you're free to check the geometry, it's a very reliable method in principle, and indeed in practice.
Going on that front, because I do understand the problem that Sue is raising. Obviously, you can trickle the way you not only model, but also in terms of, let's say, occupancy patterns for daylight autonomy or something that can actually, or the reflectance of the surfaces.
There's loads of gameplay you can do, but if it's purely geometry, there's no gameplay.
If someone doesn't wants to be malicious in a sense to pass the minimum requirements, they can do it potentially on a dynamic simulation.
Sure.
So my question is, shouldn't we be sort of setting some sort of standard inputs that should be used on those new methods? Like you have the analogy for the thermal simulations where you have a set of models for thermal modeling. If there should be some sort of initial assumptions that you could set up to level the approach when you are analysing
that's sort of happening with large-scale public projects with the requirements for a certain level of BIM.
Yes.
So, I mean, this sunlight beam and sky index stuff, I mean, I use radiance simply because I'm familiar with using radiance, but it's a very simple idea. I mean, it's probably the place for it would be a Revit plugin, where whenever you have an aperture, these numbers just get tagged on, assigned to it. And there's a phenomenal level of detail in these modern BIM models for large projects.
I think one of the wider conversations we've got to have is over what is a 3D model. Because when you talk to the Alistairs and Michaels and that in the room that are from a rights of light background, the accuracy that those models have been built to in terms of the survey that underlies them is to a very high standard. Because if there's error in our positioning of the windows and the height mass, that's affecting the amount of money that is effectively handed over. So there's a motivation for the developer to pay for the survey accuracy like models. Go and talk to a noise engineer. Go and talk to other people in like CIBSEs who will say, we've done a modelling exercise, and what they're plugging into their like software to generate some numbers. And I use noise as an example in terms of, you'll see in planning applications now some very colour coded like noise like assessments. Those models are not to the same accuracy standard as a rights of light model. They are not even to the same accuracy standard as the daylight models that I've been critical of. They are extremely simplistic. But in that part of the profession, that's the norm, that's perfectly acceptable. And what young engineers, young surveyors who don't know, so we say, the culture of another part of the profession are doing quite reasonably is they're taking, well, this is our noise model that we've agreed, and some software systems allow you, because you can buy different bolt-ons to them, we'll take the noise model and we'll now run it through the daylight answer. We'll now run it through different plugins off the same model. Well, surely that makes sense, because same model, same answer, common platform. But the cultural expectation of what is currently an acceptable noise model doesn't work in our things. There's a lot we've got to talk about in terms of this issue of accuracy, this issue of what is a three-dimensional model, and have a debate wider than just the Daylight Group. Because ultimately we're now at the point, and BIM's a good example of it, the BIM culture is that a developer is paying for one model, and that's used for everything. And we need to get into that sort of culture.
Can I say that I very much appreciate what you're saying in terms of us being all part of a professional environment which self-regulates, okay? Because otherwise we all end up being liable for stating something which isn't true.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether a very pragmatic way of giving some, safety or reassurance to local authorities would be to just state in our reports what are the assumptions we make. I know for a fact that not always, you can find stated what you've used, but in our reports you get information about the survey you've used, the model you've used, even the reflectancy you've used.
How about making the 3D model available with the final report?
Yeah, in Brights of Light, that's actually what happens.
Yeah.
So when you actually compare, that's what you do.
I think then you would actually create a situation where, just through a natural process, you would end up with good quality models. I think if everything depended on your 3D model and it's out there for people to look at, I think everyone would make the effort to make sure their models were up to snuff.
But this is the question of culture in different parts of the profession. In Rights of Light, it's the norm. I regularly see Alistair's models. Alistair regularly sees my models. Our CAD teams swap them over, check them. We come up with an agreed model because that's what the money's based on. I've got umpteen GIA models on my system. That's our culture. It's not the culture in other parts.
I'm not convinced the problem you're saying is. I was speaking to somebody in the audience during the coffee break, and occasionally we get figures that, instinctively, it's not rocket science again. You look at it and you instinctively know whether those figures are close to being right or not, and you can quickly work out if they're being made up. First thing I do is who's put in the report in the first place. If it's one of the big guns that regularly submit in Westminster, I know there'll be nothing to worry about. If it's somebody, well, who are they? What qualifications have they got to produce this report? You then start diving a little bit deeper and you start doing a few cross checks to make sure that it is right. And believe you me, they all get found out in Westminster. So we don't get many surveys that come through that are inaccurate. I think there should be an accreditation system anyway to say that you're accredited to provide these figures. I think it makes sense to do that in any event because that should be good practice. I don't think you can compare noise. I'll tell you why you can't compare noise. If somebody, problem noise is it changes all the time. And you're out there and you measure the noise, and we'll say, yeah, you did it at 3 o'clock in the morning. Of course it's going to be quieter than 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it is much more dynamic in terms of mitigating noise against the residents. So if we get an application for air conditioning plant and there's a residential window nearby, we ask them to provide a report. We can never tell for absolutely sure that that plant will meet our condition 10 dBA below the ambient noise level. But what we say to them is, listen, your report looks right, it's probably going to meet it, we're going to put the condition on. If you don't comply with the condition, you'll be made to close the plant down. It's a pretty big incentive if you've spent a lot of money on kit and then an environmental health officer goes out there after you put it in and they measure it and find out it does breach the condition. It's very, very expensive to retrospectively try and address that issue. So when it comes that sort of issue, the noise experts, they know they're not going to get away with it because as soon as the plant goes in and they turn it on, when the complaints come in, if they don't comply with the condition, they're in trouble. So it's not in their interests to play around with their figures because they will get caught.
Will I ask Paul Littlefair what's his opinion in terms of, for instance, publishing case studies? Because I do know BRE has a strong tradition of showing case studies that could potentially highlight to more people how to do and accurately do good studies that potentially would develop the culture of to minimize errors and to promote good design. Not only could be obviously in daylighting, but integrating with other areas as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It's not something we've actually. I guess the thing is that people are using software now, aren't they? So whether it would be, I guess you could have a situation where you have a sort of standard geometry and you say, right, this is going to be the vertical sky component for this, and then people could check the software they were using against it. So that might be one possible way forward. It could be something that CIBSE could do.
Or even practices as SGIA to actually advertise and publish like case studies that they've done on not because even this publication that you are involved with, it touches not deeply in case studies.
Yeah. Well,
and if that's advertised, just like councils could say, well, this has been approved and it's a case that we considered is a good example. I don't know, it's sometimes people learn by looking at others' examples or even bad cases. Could be even.
in the hierarchy of RICS publication documents, the lowest level is called an information paper, and in that's what you're talking about. It's below the guidance note, and it's basically to inform professional practice. And in terms of the institution, there is absolutely no problem in ever creating guidance notes or information type like papers. But what it needs is you lot to volunteer. Because do not underestimate the number of hours that we are talking about in terms of the task. The guidance notes that we've worked on are hundreds of hours of work, and eventually at some point we've got to earn a living to feed our families. So to say to the same sort of like people in here, oh, now go off, Andrew, and write another like information like paper. I'm not hostile to the idea, but I don't necessarily, being perfectly selfish about this, want to be the primary author of another like document. I've had my fun doing them for the last like 10 years. You know, it's time for the next generation in this room to start stepping up to the mark and saying, I am a young qualified surveyor, let me onto the panel and the working group, I want to write an information paper. No one is going to say no to you. We will give you all the help and support you need. But you've got to volunteer.
No, sorry, Andrew, that's not a volunteer. I'm not.
I don't know you're writing them.
No, David Mulby, MBS Software. Just to go back to your point, John, about checking after or telling them after, as far as the air conditioning unit is concerned. Do you have any sort of checks with regard to whether what was designed and analysed and all the reports done was what was actually built?
Yes, we do. We do, because we have two parts of condition we put on, because we say the plant must operate 10 dBA below the ambient noise level. Now, when they came out and did a survey, there may be very noisy equipment next door that's raising the ambient noise level. And 3, 4, 5 years down the line, that closes down. The premises, the business closes down, the kit goes away, the ambient noise level's dropped. You still have to be 10 dBA below the ambient noise level. So what we say to people is that's what the condition says. So when you put it up, it's in your interest that in case the ambient noise level drops, because if you've got old noisy kit around you, at some stage they're going to be replaced and you might get caught because you've designed it to be 10 dBA with all the kit around you've got at the moment. They can come in, we send out an environmental health officer and they actually take measurements to say, here's your equipment working. We then fix the noise that's coming out of the equipment and we agree that it's 10 dBA below the ambient noise level on the nearest affected window. So it's fixed. So if the noise levels drop, you're not caught because you won't be in future. And ambient noise levels in the West End have actually gone down since we brought in this draconian condition, because the first people started to put up thinking, oh, we'll get away with it as normal. You just need one resident to phone up and say, I think this thing's performing louder than what you think, and they're out there with their meters and they get done. And we used to get a lot of retrospective applications for additional baffling on the equipment. Now it's much, much less. You only get it occasionally because they realise game's up. So generally they do comply.
No, I accept. I was trying to use the analogy with daylight tests. Have you,
I think it's
when what was built and what was analysed was
know
not...
as well as I do, you go on somebody's window and it changes virtually by the minute, never mind the time of year. It's almost impossible. I mean, the human eye is so receptive. It's like, you know, the story you say to somebody, you're sitting reading a book or something, and eventually you put the electric light on, you think, oh my goodness, I didn't realise I got that dark. I mean, it is amazing the levels that the human eye will allow to drop before you make the decision to turn on the electric light. So it's very difficult to go in and say, hey guys, this is okay, we got it right. It doesn't work like that.
It's very difficult to determine that an overcast sky actually conforms to a CIE overcast sky pattern. The vast majority of them don't. So in terms of actual verification, any form of actual physical measurement with daylight is difficult. However, if the basis depends purely on geometry, that you can check.
Well, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
The building is 10 metres higher than what was
Exactly.
The gentleman on the fourth row.
Yeah, it's a question about methodologies for working out alternative targets. So it's really interesting, your presentation, sort of quantifying to some degree the other factors that are involved in different urban environments. I wonder if there's anything sort of tangible in terms of setting the targets from that, other than just what we might do, which is look at a specific environment, look down the road, and sort of see, you know, well, let's do a test here, this is a typical part of that city. Would doing that somehow encompass all of those things you were talking about, so they'd all be happening in the background, the fact that the transport was an important factor, and that, you know, these other things. Just from a specific sort of technical point of view, just trying to work out how to proceed in terms of setting a target, I guess it'd be nice if there were some other specifics that could feed into setting that number for a locale.
Interesting question. I don't know exactly how you would go about fixing a target in the first place, but what you can, or where we are at, because it is work in progress, is to actually try and understand whether you fit within a similar bracket. I appreciate what John was saying, actually. If you, the major problem, I think, is having a fixed target in the first place, because that takes away at the understanding.
Something that was written down somewhere, particularly.
No, exactly.
You know,
but if you go and test 3 windows down the road, and you find a window that works worse, which is Paul's issue, how is that a good target for what you are trying to do?
Exactly.
It isn't. So I think what you need to do is you need to step back and look a little bit wider, and actually understand, for instance, in conversation with the local authority, what are other schemes of similar nature, because that's what the actual SPG says, you know, of comparable nature to what you are trying to achieve, how that operates. So that there isn't such a simple answer as one measurement, but there is a much healthier conversation to be had amongst more
I guess I'm
parties.
looking for bridges between the discussion, which is clearly valid and includes lots of things, bridges between that and then comment upon, you know, such and such a daylight study.
The example that we actually made only has daylight and sunlight as 2 factors that effectively are derived by the morphology of the place that you've studied. Everything else, much like John was pointing out, is out there to be measured, and it's fixed until it changes. But, you know, in building times. So you can go and measure all of the roads, all the heights, all of the window dimension. You can actually make it your own way of approaching it if you want to, and then also do a daylight and sunlight study of it. I think one of the first issues that actually Paul pointed out to us when we were starting this approach was which examples are you selecting, you know, and are they fit for purpose? And it's an extremely valid point, and one that needs to be discussed. So I think the broader you make it as, you know, as a conversation with other parties involved, the less disagreement there's going to be that those examples are actually comparable. And by doing so, you actually adhere to the policy too. And then you work out how you demonstrate that. But again, maybe...
I think the problem is, you know, a place like London is so dynamic. Not only are a lot of streets very, very different to the next street, parts of that street are very different to the rest of that street. Parts of that building are very different to the rest of that building. So it's very difficult to say, here's a good example, because of the amount of variance you get. You get a whole row of buildings, they're all differently designed, they've got different floor-to-ceiling heights, they're used in different ways. Somebody's got accommodation that's very much open plan, somebody's got small rooms. That's one of the problems we get on viability assessments, is that a window on the same building on the same street, you get a very different valuation for a window right next to it, just because the characteristics of where it is. It varies so much. So if you start to homogenise things, you start to lose the character of the area, and very much the West End is about the character of it. You know, we've got standards, but standards are there as a guide. They're not there to be adhered to. So, for example, Shaftesbury own much of Soho and Carnaby Street. They said to us, you've got these flat sizes. The problem we've got is they don't really work on our properties, because if we adhere to a minimum size, we end up with twin floor flats. And and that means we end up with very big flats. But we don't, the market's not there for big flats in these narrow streets in Soho. People are very happy to live in a flat that's below your minimum standard. It's the sort of people that want to be out there, and they love Soho and they love the nightlife and the buzz about it. It's ideal for them. It doesn't meet your standard though, and it means we can get 4 apartments in the building rather than maybe 2, and that's not really an effective use of the land. So when we went in and examined the accommodation they've got, I said, yes, it's below the standards, but we totally get it. You are compensated by the location that you're actually living in that part of London, that you haven't got the amenity levels that somebody might have a little bit further out, but because you're benefiting from being right there with the nightlife and so on and everything else, that compensates A, living in a smaller space than what the minimum standard says it should be, and also lower daylighting levels.
Afternoon, Dylan Jones. Is it the case that we've got 3 strands at the end of the day? If you look at rights of light practice, you start with a legal foundation, and everything is built on that, and then you've got the technical analysis, technical criteria, and you've got surveying practice. Well, as far as daylight and sunlight goes, I think that the starting point should be statutory legal foundation, but that is a little amorphous. Subjectivity isn't the problem, but it's pretty amorphous. However much work we try and do in relation to technical analysis or practice has to live within a legal framework. And is it not the case that all 3 need to be advanced in order to come to a conclusion at the end of the day? We've probably looked at 2 of them more than all 3 today.
Whenever I have conversations with international investors and international like fund managers, trying to explain to them that rights of light is one calculation, that planning daylight and sunlight is a totally different set of calculations, and then when I'm advising them in terms of what light we're bringing into their own design, that's going to be a totally different set of calculations, they just look at me as a joker. Sort of, what are you UK people up to? Can't you just decide on one calculation?
Well, actually, we're probably ahead of the world in that, and many of our standards are actually replicated by France and Italy, for example, quite inappropriately for.
They are,
it is complicated. It is a complicated question, and there aren't a simple answer. And there's certainly no other country that has anything better than we have. And the Republic of Ireland is probably the most copycat of us, in that they have similar climate, so it is similar latitude, so it is appropriate. But in terms of communication, if we could reach an agreement on one set of calculations for the whole design process, how we're assessing the neighbouring property, how we're assessing the context in planning, it would make the design process, the communication with design teams, the communications with objectors, the communications with everyone in the process a lot easier. To do it is not a simple task. Rights of light is embedded in our common law system, and the Law Commission review that was published 2 years back highlights the system problems we've got of changing where we are. The planning system is actually an easier one for us to change, because it's effectively getting the powers to be to agree that BOE Guide 3rd edition is now what we go with. If that then aligns with British Standard 2018, then we've solved 2/3 of the problem. And then what effectively you would have is a test case to run the rights of light argument. It is possible, but it requires a conversation and a consensus as to what is the future of daylight sunlight calculations. Which one are we all going to pin our mast to? And whatever we come up with, let's be realistic about this. In terms of what we
do as practitioners, we are changing the size and shape of our urban environment.
Andrew, can I ask someone to ask
Yep.
another question? Stephen, please.
Can I introduce myself? I'm the former chairman of this group, Stephen Canbrooks. I lecture in UCL on light and lighting, it's master course, and my latest task, which I think I might elect all of you to help me with, is a new master's course on health and well-being in sustainable buildings.
So what are the rules on product placement in these?
So a not-for-profit organisation. And what it has, of course, is thrown up is a new way of looking at things and a set of potential metrics which will be added to this equation. Andrew is asked about what is the basis, what is the bottom line. You were cautious about giving numbers, but of course the SLL and CIBSE do provide some numbers in terms of average daylight factors. We can argue the toss about how useful they are, but they do give a little sense of grading between what may be regarded as a threshold and better practice. What they aren't yet is underpinned by is any real general understanding of well-being and health issues. They, in a sense, are a very long reflection backwards towards some of the things which we heard from John and Paul. There is a lot of back history to all of this. Yes, and if I may just put my hand up once more about, and not in a sense of correction, there is actually one country in this world which has a cast iron daylighting planning system, that's Russia and the former Soviet Union. And the underpinning of that, interesting enough, is on health legislation, not on planning. So there is a perception in Russia and in countries in the former Soviet Union, which is quite interesting because they're grappling with changes and relationships to their history, is about understanding that the presence of daylight in building is associated with health. Now, if we start to engage with this subject more strongly, and many of you will have already entered probably the well-building standard debate, we'll recognise that the whole foundation of what we're discussing is beginning to shift. At the moment, the well-building standard only refers to offices, but many of you are working with offices and the environments created with them. If we see the next, and they're threatening to bring it out, one on residential, we'll see this starting to open up in a very different way. There are different criteria, different metrics, many of them based on climate-based analysis. So that I think we need to be cognizant that while we're talking about the niceties of getting the legal system to work well and efficiently in this country, that actually I think the world will be moving on and we'll be seeing new criteria arriving and underpinned by research. And I'm sure I've said enough to give you the panel another 10 minutes to talk.
Could I just follow on that? The one thing we're really missing that would be the foundation for all of this is actual routine measurements of some luminous quantities in occupied spaces. I mean, this room has been too warm. The CO2 and the temperature are being logged probably every 5 minutes or finer than that. In all of these rooms, there's shed loads of data. We have next to nothing outside of museums and some heritage spaces in terms of routine monitoring of illumination spaces. The lighting sensors for the lights, they're not measuring proper lux. There's just some ambient value, so it'd be very difficult to use them. But yeah, we do actually need to start recording this now that it is becoming a hot topic to find out, what people are actually receiving in spaces.
Absolutely.
To build on your health and well-being comment, my colleague Maria Garcia is one of the first UK licensed accreditors of the well-being standard in the UK. Our understanding is that at the moment there's only one building that has met that accreditation standard, and that was for a refurbishment project rather than a new build. There are, we understand, 5 projects that the design teams have expressed an interest on the standard, but it's not moving forward. And just to throw even more confusion, when you go into the wellbeing standard, a whole new set of calculations there. And they have a section that they call right of light, but of course isn't right of light, it's just a totally new calculation.
I think
like method.
To answer one of your questions that you posed to the audience about looking upwards rather than downwards. The interesting thing about the well standard, and it has a huge number of flaws in which we could discuss for a long time, is it's aspirational.
Yeah, and it's higher than BREEAM Excellent.
To improve the conditions within buildings needs to demonstrate that, rather than just to demonstrate compliance. And that's, I think, in a sense, very inspirational for all of us now.
While we're on product placement, I just wanted to tell you about our new guide on lighting. Well, yes and no. We're run by a charity. We've brought out a new guide called Lighting and Health, and I wrote a very small amount of it, but two of the key authors are actually in the audience. There's Cosmin Tigliano here and Gareth Howlett. And Cosmin, if you want to know all about the WELL standard, Cosmin is a well-accredited professional as well as being a daylight and lighting expert.
We may do another daylight group looking at the WELL.
Yeah, we should do. We should have a meeting.
Absolutely. That's definitely putting people on the agenda, not just the building.
So can I say that there's a line on the Patrick Moraz album, who used to be a keyboardist in Yes, and an album called The Story of I, and it says there's nothing new except for what's being forgotten. And I'm sorry, but it's the same with this one. People have been looking at well-being in the built environment for years. Ebenezer Howard came up with 3 magnets, town, it's filthy, dirty, polluted country, nice out there, but there's no employment. Put it together and you get your garden cities, and it's all fantastic. It's been looked at for years. But the reality is this all rests down with politics, and the government knows that if it starts to raise the standards, you won't get any more development in the West End of London because it's not going to meet the well-being standards, and then they're going to have to start building on the Green Belt, and they just don't want to go there. So,
God forbid, outside of London. Has anybody thought about that?
There is I fully understand what people are saying, and we know about the benefits. If you're in hospital, make sure you're in a south-facing ward because it kills off all the germs. You have much more chance of catching the bug in a north-facing ward, and we know all that. But the reality of it is hospitals have wards that face south, and they've got wards that face north because it's to do with the economics of it. And the government's paranoid that if you start raising standards, it's going to mean less development because it doesn't meet those standards. So they're always extremely careful before they bring in any changes because they want to know economically, everything's driven by the Treasury, the whole governance of this country is driven by the Treasury, and the Treasury say, what's the economic impact on this one? And if it affects the economics, the answer is going to be no.
I'm going to...
Yes, hi.
No, it wasn't you, it was... Sorry, apologies.
Olivier Dambrun here. I wanted to address, to speak about a little bit of the potential of impact of us practitioners in the daylighting in the design industry as well. The problem that I find as a practitioner is that often we assess daylight sunlight as of a design that is completely final and static. So we test a design and see, and we play on small numbers and does it pass or not. And then our leverage and the weight we have on a board meeting is actually saying, well, this is going to cost you so much to revise your design. So I love that there are BRE guidelines. I love that there are so many people involved, but could we have a bit of support from these guidelines to suggest that we should integrate consultants at the very early stages of design so that we could help architects take the decisions in order to ensure and to grant that the final product will perform safely, largely way above and beyond of any of the minimal requirements.
Quick comment from anyone?
With the advantage of those who come from a right to light background, we're often instructed and by developer clients, sometimes in pre-purchase. So sometimes our ability to influence shape and massing, there are certain developers who are what I call informed developers, where we do massing shapes for them, both for the rights of light and the planning daylight and sunlight answer, and they're thinking about this well in front of other people. But this is, you can't say all developers are the same. There are those developers that are, if you like, light aware, and there are those that the first time they think about daylight and sunlight is when they're going through their validation list and they see that they've got to submit this daylight sunlight thingy, and you get this bizarre call at 4 o'clock on a Friday saying, "Hi, can you just say my scheme is wonderful, I need to put my application in by 5 o'clock."
Thank you.
Just a very quick comment on that. They come to do the initial massing optimization because there is a rights of flight issue, and rights of flight usually costs a lot. So the drive behind this optimization of the massing is the rights of flight, and we forget about the actual building performance in the end, which incorporates noise, natural ventilation, thermal performance, etc., etc. So you optimize a scheme just for one parameter because it costs a lot and forgets all the rest. So I mean, the idea is like
in the spectrum.
Yeah,
yes,
so
you're right. This is where you know when you're trying to say there is a developer, they're not all the same, and we have some that are very environmentally aware and are really on tune and are using us to our full extent, and then it peters down, and then you get those that just pay for the right to like iceberg model, and we say, well, what about the rest of the service we can provide? Oh, we don't want that. And then it keeps on sort of like going, and then you get the totally unaware. My feel is that the unaware is a bigger lump than the aware. And that's a burden on all of us to educate our own client bases.
I'm going to take 2 more questions and then...
One hand has been going up there all the time.
Yeah.
So, my name's Ed Whelan, I'm from Cundall, home of the first world building in Europe. So if you want to hold the next one about world buildings, I'm sure we can accommodate that. A lot of the conversation has been around the impact on the surrounding buildings and planning, the actual buildings that are being built. Something we're seeing quite a lot as a result of some of the standards, particularly around daylight factors, and the amount of glass that's being put into a building to meet planning, is that it's having a big impact on overheating. And in some of the schemes that we're having to put in, because insulation standards and everything else has increased significantly since those standards were set, that we're overlighting a space perhaps, encouraging more light into the space and encouraging more heating, and then we're having to resort to fairly extreme measures to meet the overheating criteria, which have moved on since. So there's now a headbutt between these 2 criteria, and it seems like lighting isn't really caught up. In terms of overheating, there are now, with TM59 in the overheating group, there's a set of standards that these are the indoor conditions that you must test against, which now allows us to benchmark quite nicely the performance of the building in terms of natural ventilation. And it seems like the standards from the lighting group in CIBSE need to catch up with that and produce a similar standard, as you were saying, like standardised reflectances, standardised radiance settings, for example, to put into your climate-based or your daylight factor calculations in order to set a benchmark that means you can't game the system, it means that you are coming up with something.
And 3 criteria is based on an annual, daily, and some sort of extremes, like the TM52 for comfort. Just...
Michael Murray. I think before we've been talking a lot about alternative criteria for assessing daylight and sunlight, particularly within the planning sphere. We really need a huge amount more training, knowledge and understanding within local authorities, and if I can cite 2 examples, one in Hackney, one in Tower Hamlets, where so not in Westminster, where we've submitted our results, and the answer has been in both cases, what bit of 20% don't you understand? We will accept losses of 19.99%, but not 21%. And that is the approach they have taken. In another instance, a council well outside London, we produced a daylight and sunlight report. In their refusal document, the council said that my report was all well and good, but was just a lot of nerdy numbers. in the subsequent appeal, Her Majesty's Inspector said that it was a pity that the local authority hadn't understood the daylight and sunlight report, nor could be troubled to engage a consultant to advise them who did. Had they done so, they would have realised it was done in accordance with the BRE guide, that the figures produced were correct. The inspector, whom Paul had probably trained down at Bristol, had done his own check calculations and said, yes, and for these reasons, I therefore allow this appeal. And that council, as a result, had a very bloody nose. But that's the sort of lack of understanding and training that we have to counter before we can go to alternative targets.
Well, I remember doing a public inquiry, 5-day inquiry on daylight and sunlight, and the first half day was teaching the inspector. So daylight and sunlight standards, which we jointly did, the appellant and me, because the inspector didn't understand it. So I think there's varying degrees of expertise or lack of it in the planning inspector as well. I mean, you saw my presentation, I agree with you. I don't think there is enough training on it. I think planning schools have got to a lot to answer for it. And I think that to stop planning authorities just saying it's 20% because that's what the document says, therefore that means that's it. If there was a tweak, a fine-tuning of national guidance to say that's a broad basic test, you've got to then look at the characteristics of the site for lots of reasons that I gave and others have given, that may not necessarily be the criteria that you throw out or keep an application in. It's naivety because an awful lot of them never get this. They can sit in the planning department for 10 or 15 years before this hits them and they don't know what to do. So they pick up a document and says, oh, that's what it says, that's what I will do. That's the problem.
I think, to be fair to the two councils that you mentioned in London, in the past I've seen situations where they have adopted a flexible approach, and I've actually provided training for planning officers from both boroughs. So maybe you were just unlucky in your choice of planning officer.
We were just unlucky in our choice of case officers.
You might have had where sometimes it goes down to politics and the politicians are saying to them, it's too political this site, we're going to stick to the 20%. And you're always going to get political decisions in every local authority, and even in Westminster, where the politics gets in the way of the officer.
Talking to the potential volunteers in the room and the academics, RICS now has invested in an online training platform. And I created the 1-month training module in Rights of Light. The next task that they have floated was to do the same on daylight and sunlight. The academics will be well aware that to create the online presentations and everything, for this is not a short number of hours. If there is someone that wants to volunteer to do this, I am happy to give show you how it's done and give the teaching side of things. There is the potential there. And once it's created, the advantage of these online learning platforms is people who are in sort of local authority officers and such like that may not get the day release to come to a UCL and do the full masters course, might get funding from their employer to do a 1-month online distance learning type course. And the platform is there. We just need to volunteer to them to say we will create the technical content. So the solution is within our system. But it takes, so we say, the rest of the room. You can't just keep looking at the panel and saying, Andrew, go off and do all of this. You've got to step up to the mark. And then you'll have your solutions.
Thank you all the panel. Thank you all the audience. And